Aron is Texas' State Director of American Atheists. He's a free talk contributor to the Global Secular Council and host of the bi-monthly podcast called The Raw Man. Aron is one of the YouTube atheists and an advocate for rationalism in science classrooms. The videos often focus on evolution and the evidence indicating an interrelated tree of life. His series, summarizing the foundational falsehoods of creationism, and a subsequent series, Falsifying Phylogeny, have been mirrored, featured, referenced, and recommended by many professional scientists, secularists, and educators, and has attracted more than 110,000 subscribers to his YouTube channel. The first of these two series, the Foundational Falsehoods, is what introduced Aron to me, and I've seen and heard him on other places online since then, including podcasts like The Atheist Experience and The Dogma Debate. One of his previous recent high-profile events was the Unholy Trinity Tour, which is a traveling lecture put on by Aron, Matt Dillahunty, and Seth Andrews, who we had here recently. And this tour has been extended. The three of them are going to be traveling to Australia and New Zealand, giving lectures there. The title of Aron's talk today is What We Can and Cannot Say We Know. And what I can say at this moment is it's time to start. So please welcome everybody.
Thank you, Coach. Glad to be into the sun. Normally, I prefer to talk about matters of fact rather than philosophy, but when they invited me to speak in Arizona, they gave me the topic they wanted to talk about, or they wanted me to talk about what we can and cannot say we know. This is very similar to a talk I gave to the atheist community of Austin a few years ago, what we can honestly say we know. This won't be that same talk because I've actually changed my position on a couple of things since then. It's not that it turned out that I didn't really know what I thought I knew. I knew more than I thought. But it turned out that the people I was arguing with did something entirely different than I thought they did. At that time, I hadn't yet met David Silverman, the new powder keg president of American Atheists. But I took that opportunity to criticize him over a billboard campaign that I didn't agree with. He, of course, had billboards that said that represent Christianity, Judaism, and Islam with "You know it's a myth," written in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. And at the time, I argued that those who believe in these religions don't know that it's a myth. For the most part, I think that's probably true. I have since discovered that a lot of these people do know it's a myth, but they're going to continue to believe anyway, because that's what they want to believe. And they'll say, these may be what the facts are, I prefer to believe this. Or they might say, if believing in God is wrong, I want to be right. Sometimes we get blatant admissions, like this one. She says that if I found that Jesus did not rise again, faith requires me to believe anyway. I hope my faith would be strong enough to believe even when my eyes tell me otherwise. So she is determined to keep believing, even if she knows for certain that it is not true. And this isn't an insult either. This is the core of the problem when you're arguing with religious believers. That's not to say that all religious believers are like this. Many of them can be reasoned with some patient coaxing. Those who won't be reasoned with will reveal themselves pretty quickly and will probably run for public office. These are the ones who are being unreasonable on purpose, who say that if the Bible said that 2 plus 2 equals 5, that they believe it anyway. For them, belief is a verb, something done deliberately, as an act of sheer will, of mind over matter. So I was surprised to find, when talking about faith, that these guys got it right. Because religion isn't about truth. It's about pretend. It is literally make-believe. And truth is irrelevant. I'm normally pretty good at defining my terms, but the word truth presented a challenge. What does truth really mean? In the sense that how can scientists, philosophers, and theologians all use that one word the same way, the way they necessarily have to, in order to communicate? Especially when you're talking about absolute truth. Then what is it? And the first time I published commentary on this, I interpreted that phrase to be essentially the same thing as perfect knowledge, because that's the context that is generally involved when you listen to the theists plead for the authority of their various scriptures. Consequently, I guess I was trying to be philosophical, looking for the deepest possible meaning of truth. So in my video on the third foundational falsehood of creationism, I said that there was no such thing as absolute truth. And what I meant by that was that reality is not true, but statements about reality can be if they're true. When you testify in trial, it then becomes the job of the court to determine if what you just said is the truth. And bearing that in mind, I have to define truth as a statement or expression that can be shown to be true. It isn't truth just because you say it is. If you can't show it's the truth, then you don't know it's the truth. But then the limits of human understanding and perception are such that our knowledge will never be absolutely complete nor flawless enough to be called absolute. Many religious types have since criticized me for this, saying that I contradicted myself whenever I expressed certainty in certain things that were known to science. How could you be sure of anything if there's no such thing as absolute truth? It seemed as though they thought that truth exists independent of description or perception. So in November of 2011, I was arguing with Pastor Bob Enyart on his weekly radio talk show, and he pressed me on the same point. It quickly became obvious in our discussion that he was not using so lofty a definition of truth as I was. So I asked him to clarify. It turned out that all he meant, and that all any apologist really meant, was that absolute truth only meant whether or not we could know things for certain. That's it. It was so simple. Here I was playing way beyond their game, trying to contemplate the truth of truth. And when I realized how utterly basic their definition turned out to be, I remember thinking, I wish I knew that before. Later on, I went to the Reason Rally in Washington, D.C., and I met Eric Hovind, son of the convicted fraud Dr. Kent Hovind. He's the charlatan behind Creation Science Ministries. And if you don't know, a charlatan is one who practices quackery, typically by pretending to be a doctor when they don't have a real PhD. Anyway, Eric Hovind is an example of the apple that didn't fall far from the con man. He immediately asked me whether we could know anything for certain, and I answered in the affirmative, although I don't like to use absolutes and I use them sparingly. So he later said that I said no, and he kept the original video available online so people will know better. I've noticed a consistent pattern whenever I argue with religious apologists. Their arguments are so flimsy, indefensible, and unsupported that they can't be right unless reality is wrong. If their God isn't real, then nothing is real. So the first thing they attack is reality itself. And I've tried to explain that even if reality isn't real, even if we only exist in the dream of Brahma, or if all we perceive is a computer-enhanced hallucination like the Matrix, it doesn't change the fact that the rules of that imposed video game reality still apply to us, so that whatever reality we inhabit is still real to us. That is our reality. And reality is real by definition. And this makes this kind of apologetic sophistry meaningless philosophical nonsense. And the point is that if I had met Eric Hovind back when I had posted the third foundational falsehood of creationism, and he had asked me then whether I believed that humans could claim knowledge of absolute truth, I would have thought that he was asking a different and deeper question, and I would have given him the opposite answer. Now I know what he means. And Hovind's associate, Saiten Bruggencate, was also at the Reason Rally, literally protesting reason. He and I have since debated a couple of times on whether it is possible to know anything at all. And the mindset of a presuppositional apologist, they can't know anything if we know anything, and they can't claim to know better unless we don't know it either. It is thus whatever logical fact you try to point out will only proper to say, how do you know that? Or indeed, how can you really be sure you know anything? How do you know that the laws of physics won't change 5 seconds from now? And there is some irony in his arguments, one of them being that he said that if one is mentally incapable of reason, they wouldn't know that they were unable to reason. And so I proved this by demonstrating this failure constantly. For example, he said that it's not special pleading if you're pleading for God. Because God is a special case, and so is sight and proving case. Because he also says that whether we read the Bible or not, the Bible forms the basis of all our knowledge claims. And there's no exceptions made for people of other cultures who obviously know things but have never even seen the Bible. And there's no exception or consideration of people who have studied the Bible in depth and understand it a lot better than Ruby King does. Science insists he cannot be wrong because God has revealed to me in such a way that I can know it for certain. So the question I put to Cy was this. Sir Isaac Newton, arguably the most brilliant man who ever lived, was, embarrassingly enough, a deeply religious Christian and even a creationist, according to the modern definition. Newton declared that he had been specially chosen by God to receive personal divine revelation, leading to a greater understanding of the Scriptures than any other man. And that means that Newton must have understood the Scriptures better than Cy and Ruby. However, Cy makes a similar claim, albeit not quite as lofty and without near as much credence. Both men claimed a perfectly inerrant, infallible knowledge of things that can't be tested and for which there is no evidence whatsoever. So there's no way to show that, and thus no way either man could honestly know that, but that's only part of the problem. The real trouble is that these men disagree on a critical tenet of their shared religion, and they can't both be right at the same time. That means that despite all their insistence of infallible certainty, one of them has to be wrong. The issue is that neither one would admit that he can be wrong. God has revealed it to them in such a way that each man can know it for certain. Cy 10 believes that Jesus is the essence of God made flesh, and he says that this was revealed to him by God through Scripture, which of course we know isn't really true. It's a matter of indoctrination. This is what other people interpret the Bible told him. Sir Isaac Newton said that Jesus is not the same entity as God, and that this was a divine revelation of Scripture too. I know exactly what he means. I could argue the same point for him, because the Bible never implies a Trinity, and Jesus never describes himself as being an avatar of God made flesh. Different people interpret it different ways, and that's what's really happening here. What both men actually mean is that this is how they interpret Scripture, though neither one would admit that. Cy will not consider that his belief even could be in error. Instead, he deflects any possible blame away from himself and back onto God, thus making Cy like unto God. If Cy is wrong, then God is wrong. And how could God be wrong? Newton apparently held essentially the same position just as rigidly and for the same reasons. But the principle of non-contradiction demands that at least one of these men, and probably both of them, arrived at their respective conclusions on their own imperfect means without the guidance of any deity. Logically, that has to be the case, but neither monk would admit that, even to themselves. Stoic believers tend not to. Each man will immediately dismiss the other's position without consideration, but will not reconsider his own position. Cy also says that the only way to know anything is to believe in God. And he gives no intelligible reasons for this. He simply says that the proof that God exists is that without him you couldn't prove anything. And amusingly, he can't prove that. And we can prove otherwise. But it gets worse. Cy's argument is that you can't know anything unless you know everything. And in order to have any knowledge at all, you first have to have infinite knowledge. knowledge, and only God has infinite knowledge. So in order to be sure of anything, you either have to be God, or you have to know God, and have direct divine revelation from God. And every part of this argument is logically invalid. Erroneous assumptions piled upon baseless speculation stacked like a house of cards floating in the clouds. But more importantly, regarding the mirror positions of Psi and Newton, the mere fact that this disagreement exists at all is enough by itself to refute Psi's knowledge claim. For Psi to admit why this logical impasse even exists is to concede that regardless of what the details of the conflict might be, the justification for his knowledge claim has already failed. Because on his own criteria, he can't claim to know anything because both men face the same conundrum. Either one could be wrong, even about the most important thing each man thinks he knows. And that this is an epistemological certainty. The point is that neither of these men actually knows what they say they know. Philosopher Peter Boghossian famously defined faith as pretending to know what you don't know. He and I find it the same way, and that's exactly what happened here. The relevant point to epistemology is this. Psi likes to say that we use our reasoning to justify our reasoning. And that is actually what Psi is doing. And he seems to be aware of that. He admits that his is a circular argument. He just pretends that ours is circular too. And the excuse that he gives is he says that his is virtuously circular. And that ours is viciously circular. But I explained to him that no, we don't use our reasoning to justify our reasoning. We use scientific methodology instead. And that works exactly opposite of faith. That's why it works at all. Science neither requires nor desires faith, and presuppositions don't fly either, because it demands that we question all assumptions. So all postulations must be based on prior evidence. Otherwise, it's just speculation. There's no way to test it. And it isn't science. All hypotheses have to be testable and potentially falsifiable, which means there has to be some way written into the method wherein some experiment or discovery could prove the hypothesis wrong. This is another way of using objective reality to justify our reasoning, or correct it if necessary. We're playing a game of 20 questions. Every new piece of information will change your initial position. Believers complain that science changes all the time, but they don't understand that every change is an improvement, zeroing in on a more accurate focus in a quest for truth. The science isn't a one-man operation either. Every experiment and all your calculations have to be submitted to peer review so that everyone else can test them too, checking your math, confirming your results, so that no one ever need rely on their reasoning to justify their reasoning. And this is when Psi would argue that, but we can't know if we're sane. But if you're rational enough to communicate, then you're rational enough to submit your ideas to objective analysis. And for this method to fail, we all have to be insane. Which is, I think, what he's depending on. Within this reality, yes, it is possible to know things. You don't have to know it absolutely either. There is such a thing as reasonable certainty. But when you're arguing with theists, they use double standards. Even if you couldn't possibly be wrong about everything, if you admit that there's some particular thing you could be wrong about, well, then you're wrong about everything. And even though there's nothing they can show that they're right about, they'll still claim absolute certainty if you honestly concede any uncertainty. That's because faith relies on an assertion of conviction. I don't remember if it was Jimmy Stewart or Jimmy Swaggart or Jerry Falwell, but I think it was one of them who said, I know that 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 I know there's a God. And that's a wonderful expression of conviction, but it's still an empty assertion. He's obviously pretending to know what he doesn't really know. And knowledge is typically defined as a justified belief, that meaning that it can be tested and demonstrated with measurable accuracy. If you can't show it, you don't know it. So if it can't be tested, if you confirm or correct it, then it does not qualify as knowledge. Everybody wants to say that there are certain things that they know that they know, but that they can never demonstrate or prove to anyone else. That's fine, I understand why they say that. But at the same time, if we can't confirm your accuracy to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then it is a fact that you cannot actually know what you think you know. And all this ties to Gnosticism. The Gnostics were an ancient sect who believed that faithful conviction equals knowledge. They would express what they believe as what they know. And many Christians still behave that same way. They state their beliefs as if it was a matter of verifiable fact. They could prove it, they had to, but they can't. Because they're talking about things that are not evidently true and can only be assumed on faith. And people who make this kind of empty assertion are particularly annoying to men of science like Thomas Huxley, also known as Darwin's bulldog. In 1869, he complained that they were quite sure they had attained a certain gnosis, had more or less successfully solved the problem of existence, while I was quite sure I had not, and had a pretty strong conviction that the problem was insoluble. So he inverted the word agnostic, saying, do not pretend that conclusions are certain which are not demonstrated or demonstrable. Now, whether you're a Gnostic or agnostic usually relates to how you feel about theism, being belief in gods. Some people separate theism from theism, but the mainstream definition includes both. And I have to define the terms. Of course, the next group to look at is atheism, people who don't believe in gods. And they have to know what a god is before they can determine whether they believe in it, right? So when we're talking about religion, a lot of that defies definition, and that's on purpose. Because if you can rigidly establish exactly what both sides mean, then it's possible to determine which one is right. Religion doesn't want that. Religion needs ambiguity so that the goalposts can be moved when and wherever necessary. This is also to save some embarrassment. Does anyone know what it means to bless someone? It took me quite a while to find this out because most religious believers don't realize that a blessing is a magical enchantment. Remember that next time you sneeze in public. Or someone ends a telephone conversation by unaware that they just told you to have a magically enchanted day. So how can we define the properties of God to know what a God is? My favorite field of science is the classification of life forms. If you're going to categorize any collective, you have to define that group according to the unique characters that are held in common by every member already universally accepted in that set without making special exceptions for certain ones before you can determine whether some new addition truly belongs there or not. Knowing that there were hundreds of gods being worshipped by millions of people for thousands of years, it would be unfair for you to define your God in such a way that it would exclude all the others. That definition must include all of them. So if we look at their common characteristics unique to them, we see that a god is a magical, anthropomorphic, immortal. It has human characteristics like language, intelligence, vanity, jealousy, vengeance, wrath, and so on. It has miraculous powers and can survive the death of its own body, either to resurrect or reincarnate. And some people say that the Judeo-Christian God isn't like that, but yeah, they both were. Remember that the Jews didn't worship Jesus, and the Old Testament isn't talking about Jesus. But it does say that God walks, talks, eats, waves his hand, turns his head, shows his backside, and teaches a wrestling. And yes, he's magical. Magic and miracles share the same definition, being the evocation of supernatural entities or forces to control or forecast natural events. As for surviving the death of his own body, we've had some gods like Prometheus or Dionysus who were crucified, and we've had some gods who were killed and then resurrected or reincarnated, so the definition of deities is consistent. Now, if you don't believe that there is an invisible equivalent of a genie secretly spying on anything you ever do, then you're atheist. And don't say, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic. Because it's not that simple. Most theists are Gnostic. Not only do they believe in God, but they know who that God is and what he hates and all kinds of other details that couldn't possibly be derived by any other means but imagination. And some theists are agnostic. They believe in God too, but say, hey, like, who's to say what God is? Because it's logically impossible to verify or understand the properties of supernatural beings, regardless whether you believe in such things. And that's why most atheists are agnostic. The people who believe in gods generally don't call themselves agnostic. So anyone who identifies as an agnostic is almost certainly an atheist. They may not like that label because they've been conditioned to execrate it, but that the A word still applies. So most atheists are agnostic, but there are also Gnostic atheists, and I am one of those. And how could I say that I know anything about the supernatural, especially after I just said that's impossible? Part of the answer is evidence, and we're going to have to define this word too. I get into quite a quarrel over this recently, and I'm alarmed at the many ways that this word is misused. So to clarify, a fact is a point of data that is either not in dispute or is indisputable in that it is objectively verifiable. Many people want to impose their subjective impressions or misunderstandings as fact, but that doesn't work. And some people think that all facts are evidence, but a fact doesn't become evidence until it is consistent with and is thus indicative of a particular proposal or conclusion. The same fact might be equally aligned with two or more mutually exclusive conditions, but then it wouldn't be evidence of either. Different people may point to a fact which they think imply contrary conclusions, and each may present those as evidence initially, but then we have to determine which one actually is, because they can't both be, not after evaluation, because the definition implies that it, or requires that it indicate, support, or prove something. And logically, that means there can be only one. Or the facts could be discordant with both, indicating something else. For the purposes of this discussion, we will use the legal definition of proof being an overwhelming preponderance of evidence. Some people say that you can have good or bad evidence, but that doesn't make any sense. It's better to say that evidence can be strong or weak, depending on what it is. And importantly, the philosophy of science has certain rules applicable to evidence. Notice that positive claims require positive evidence and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And God is the most extraordinary claim ever, yet it's not supported by any evidence at all. In science, there is only what is supported by evidence and what is not supported, and what is not supported does not warrant serious consideration. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. So I don't need to deny what has never even been established. Nor should I consider it a possibility either. A lot of people want to say, well, anything is possible. It's not. Especially not in science. For a science to say, before a scientist can say that X is possible, they have to show some precedent or parallel indicating that possibility. Or we'd have to establish that X is indeed a fact, regardless of whether we can explain it. But one thing we know about the supernatural is that it is impossible. Whether we're talking about magic or miracles makes no difference. They're the same thing. Both are defined as being inexplicable by science because they violate the laws of physics, meaning that they're physically impossible. And God is defined by his miraculous nature, which makes God impossible by definition. There is no means known by which a mind can exist independent of the brain that generates it. No possible method of data transmission to any form of afterlife, no rational concept of how a God could exist, and no mechanism by which he can do anything. He certainly can't wish things into being. And even if we suspend all of that and assume it anyway, every aspect of any theology is logically inconsistent with many conflicting discrepancies, contradictions, and interpretations. That, and let's face it, the only source of information about gods are the incredible claims of credulous people. Ignorant devotees who don't agree with each other, but who admit they will readily lie if they have to, because they're compelled to believe and to convince others however they can. So there is no truth to the claims made about God. And this is the same criteria we apply to everything that we know does not exist. But I didn't realize that until I talked to Pastor Bob Anyard of Denver Bible Church. During our discussion, he challenged me to prove that God doesn't exist. It's logically impossible to prove a negative like this. So I countered, asking him about leprechauns and how he proved they don't exist. But he confidently said, "There's no such thing as leprechauns." So I said, "How do you know that?" And he said, "Because there is no evidence of them. Thus he knows they don't exist." Now he thinks there's evidence of God, which is another matter, but what's fair for him is fair for me. There is no God because there's no evidence of God. And having no reason to believe something is a pretty good reason not to believe it. Then my friend Christina Red made a video explaining how she knows there is no Santa Claus. The same way that she knows that there are no invisible, undetectable elves living inside her butt. And that struck a nerve with me. How can we know whether Paul Bunyan, Bugs Bunny, or Superman aren't real? Do I have to go to every galaxy far, far away to prove there was never a Darth Vader? Fortunately not. Anytime we're faced with proving a negative, we cannot logically demonstrate negative knowledge either. We don't grant unsupported absurdities equal plausibility. We default to the null hypothesis, innocent until proven guilty. That's why the burden of proof is on the one making the positive claim. You have to show that there's a there, so that I don't have to seriously consider every weird idea from anyone's fever dream. And this is how we can honestly say that we know there is no invisible pink unicorn. There is no celestial teapot. And it's going to get worse. There is no flying spaghetti. And I know I'm getting sacrilegious now. But to paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, question with boldness even the existence of Bob. Can we know that made-up characters are works of fiction and don't really exist? Can we know that this doesn't really exist? I mean, we know it's impossible for something like this to be real. It defies the laws of physics, and it can't really have this power issuing from its mouth. And we only heard of it from a series of stories that we know for certain are not true. They're just made up. But shouldn't we allow that it might still exist anyway? A lot of people say yes. But can we really be sure this doesn't exist? I mean, we know it's impossible for something like this to be real. It defies the laws of physics, and we can't really have this power issuing from its mouth. And we only heard of it from a series of stories that we know for certain are not true. They're just made up. But shouldn't we still allow that this might exist anyway? No one agrees with that. Do we know that Godzilla is not real and can't be? Besides, while it may be logically possible to disprove some, or logically impossible to disprove some lofty theistic notion of an undefined higher power, the Bible God, on the other hand, we can disprove. When I gave my talk to the atheist community of Austin, I was an agnostic atheist, and I criticized David Silverman for saying, you know it's a myth. But regardless whether believers know that or not, that's what it is. And we have everything necessary to prove it. Almost nothing in the Bible has any basis in fact at all, but it's not just the lack of evidence for it, it's the overwhelming evidence against it. And the evidence is compiling and the arguments are compelling. Look at Noah's flood, for example. I intended once upon a time to do a 5-part video series showing how archaeology disproves the flood, meteorology disproves the flood, anthropology disproves the flood, zoology disproves the flood, and even mythology disproves the flood. And of course, the flood is impossible according to physics. I lament not having made that series when I had the time. I didn't do it because I didn't think there were that many people who were that stupid. Then I saw last week's election results. Isn't it sad that our society is super saturated with sycophants who are absolutely wrong about absolutely everything? Not just science, history, and medicine, but philosophy, epistemology, morality, ethics, ecology, energy, everything. The Bible says you will know them by their fruits. What can they show besides a consistent rate of constant failure in all applications? Over the last year or so, I personally interviewed a handful of biblical scholars, historians, and experts in comparative mythology, all of whom are convinced that Jesus never existed, and neither did Moses. That they were both composites of other characters. And last month I showed that the same thing applies to the devil too. In previous talks, I've shown how the Bible has exaggerated mere animals into mythical monsters, how the Ten Commandments aren't anything like what the Christians think they are, how Genesis was derived from Mesopotamian paganism, how prayer doesn't work and faith is a failure, and how creationism actually qualifies as a psychological delusion. At the same time, there is no evidence that the universe was designed, nor could it have been, especially not by speaking things into being with an incantation spell. But there is evidence that the universe is a chaotic construct, and every indication that God is a fictitious figment of a flawed imagination. So just to clarify, yes, there are some things we can and do know for certain. Through an independent international consensus analysis by expert specialists in every relevant field of study, we now know that the Bible is wrong about the nature of the cosmos, about the value of pi, about the circle of the earth, and the firmament, and the flood, and the Tower of Babel, the Exodus, the Garden of Eden, and a host of other things. These fables have been conclusively discredited or disproved beyond redemption, such that not even the existence of God could resurrect the Bible now. We don't know everything about everything. We don't know everything about anything. But although we don't know absolutely everything, there are some things we know absolutely. The Bible and all of the religions founded on that mythology are evidently absolutely wrong, physically impossible, and logically inconsistent, so we can honestly say we know that God does not exist. We have time for Q&A.
You mentioned that what the laws of physics are subject to change, and they do change, and we learn new things, etc., etc. And today it is more rapid and more confusing even. What about the laws of logic? is this something that you can take or accept as something that is not changeable? Even in the multi-universe, that is a creation of some scientist or a string theory or whatever.
I would think that first of all that the laws of physics are not necessarily subject to change, but with the laws of logic,
What we know about it.
exactly, it's the degree of our understanding, and that we need to explore and refine it. We may discover that there may be conditions which may have adverse things that may apply.
But what about logic?
Same thing. I mean,
Do you think that what we know about logic is still subject to change the way what we consider as logical?
we have
We, I mean, not religious people, but people
humanity.
or mathematicians or things like this.
Well, I don't specialize in logic, but I would say that we have to be objective, and we have to allow that we can be in error more than we. I often say that you don't ever want to pretend that you're what you know is infallible and can never be changed, because it can be improved, and the only way to improve your understanding is to find out where the flaws exist in your current perception, and then, of course, correct them. So I would allow for the possibility of error. Anyone else?
I'm not sure I agree with the screen that gave the definition. There were two definitions of a fact. The first one was something everybody agrees on. And, obviously people used to agree that the sun revolved around the earth. So, I would say that's a bad definition. And then the other one was that it's something that can be disproven by evidence. And I would say that if the evidence hasn't been investigated, then it's only an assumed fact. So I don't think either of those definitions of facts actually give you facts.
Well, I would agree with you on the first one, because the reason that definition exists is because you can examine the facts of a story, in a hypothetical situation, given this, then that kind of thing. So you can base a hypothesis over facts and then discover later that those are not facts.
Doesn't that make them just assumptions rather than facts?
If you're analyzing a story, then you have to take as fact the given details leading up to that. So these are and as I said, the reason that they're not in dispute is because you're analyzing the context given. So that's why the point that's not in dispute would be considered a fact. I, of course, lean to the second definition of fact, which is something that can be verified. If you can't verify it, then it's not a fact.
Well, isn't it possible it might be a fact even though you don't have the means to verify? In other words, Einstein had some parts of his theory that eventually have been verified.
Right. Now, see, once it is verified, then we can call it a fact. Or you can take it as given and just take it as a fact for the purposes of your analysis.
Just to make sure we're on the same page, you started out your talk by how one of these Christians was using terms in a different way than you were, so you have to have the same definition in order to really be on the same page. Thank you.
First of all, I enjoy the topic. Is beautiful. But the question I have is, at one point, we're gonna see that all the world is gonna say there's no God.
Your question is what again?
It's at one point we're gonna see.
Oh, at what point will we see?
Yeah, the complete end of faith.
There will be a dwindling in belief in God, and unfortunately, because of human nature, in many cases, that's going to be replaced by other things. If you have ever talked directly in real life to a Bigfoot believer, you'll see what I mean. Those people have no sense of humor.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. And you mentioned the Bible. Can you say the same about the Quran, the Torah, the Book of Mormon, and all those books? It seems like if every person's got a book, then it is what they believe in is the truth. And what does what you say for the Bible hold for the Quran, hold for the Torah, hold for the Book of Mormon, hold for every other book of fancy that they come up with?
Yeah, when I was talking about the Bible, I was talking about the Old and New Testaments together, or the Tanakh, if you want, instead of just the Torah. But yes, because the Book of Mormon and the Quran are both based on the Bible, then if the foundation is unsound, then the conclusions based on that premise are going to be unsound. And the Quran also talks about the flood and so forth, so it's dependent on the same mythology.
Anyone else?
What do you think about miracles? Catholic Church saying they can prove something happened that's miraculous.
I like when people say that something is unexplained, as if that's a great thing, that somehow being unexplained makes it explained by magic. Unexplained equals unexplained. That means there's an explanation. We don't know it yet. And thus far, whatever we've examined in history, when we thought that epilepsy was demonic possession, when we thought that disease were results of witchcraft or curses, and lightning was Zeus shooting down liars and so forth, and volcanoes were gods wanting to consume virgins and so forth. Comets were omens, and all of this. And then every time we've investigated what these things really were, we discovered cosmology and tectonic plates and neuroscience and so forth. And the real explanation has always turned out to be vastly more complex. Revelation of ideas that had previously not even been considered. And magic has always turned out to be the wrong answer. And if we stuck with that wrong answer, we would still be clinging rocks together.
One of the main definitions of truth in philosophy is correspondence to reality. Why didn't you use that definition?
Well, I think I did.
No, you said about evidence.
Because if you're just going to say the phrase correspondence to reality, then we don't have any distinction between somebody who says that what they're saying is the truth and what we can show to be the truth. How do we know that it corresponds with reality? So, in my perspective,
Couldn't you ask the same question? How do you know it is evidence?
I don't understand the question. How do we know if something is evidence? Evidence is a body of facts that only align with a given conclusion.
Well, wouldn't correspondence to reality be saying the same thing?
Yes. And again, the facts also have to be verified, so it's the same application. Was there anyone else?
Yes. No other questions? Let's give it another big hand.
Thank you.